The slap echoed through the restaurant like a gunshot, and for 3 full seconds nobody breathed. Park Soo-ah, pregnant and trembling with rage, pressed her hand to her reddening cheek and turned to the most dangerous man in Seoul, expecting him to destroy the waitress who dared touch her. Instead, Choi Tae-yoon said nothing at all, and that silence was about to burn his entire empire to the ground. It was the kind of slap that didn't just land on skin. It cracked through years of silence, exposed truths buried beneath marble floors and arranged contracts, and froze an entire restaurant in place. Han Yuna didn't even remember raising her hand. She only remembered Choi Tae-yoon's eyes, dark, unreadable, and for the first time in 3 months, completely undone. Welcome to Echoes of Seoul and Africa TV besties. If you are watching this, hit the subscribe and like button right now and drop your location in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled. And follow the video all the way to the end. 3 months earlier, Han Yuna had no idea who Choi Tae-yoon really was. To her, he was simply the quiet man in the corner booth, the one who came in every Tuesday and Thursday evening, ordered the same bowl of doenjang jjigae, and read business reports while barely touching his food. He tipped generously, spoke softly, and never once raised his voice, even when the kitchen got his order wrong. The other waitresses whispered about him constantly. Did you see the car he came in? Did you see the men waiting outside? Yuna hadn't cared. She had bills to pay, a younger brother in university, and exactly 0 time to fantasize about mysterious men in expensive suits. But the first time he looked up from his phone and met her eyes, something in her chest stumbled, just slightly, like missing a step on a staircase she'd walked 1,000 times. The restaurant, Hanok Sarang, sat tucked into a quiet alley in Bukshan, the kind of place tourists rarely found and locals guarded jealously. Yuna had worked there for 2 years, ever since her father's medical bills had swallowed her college fund whole. She liked the rhythm of it. The clatter of dishes, the smell of grilled fish, the old radio playing trot music in the kitchen. It was simple. It was hers. What she didn't know was that Choi Tae-yoon had chosen this restaurant precisely because it was simple. Because for 1 hour, twice a week, nobody here knew that he controlled half the import routes running through Incheonport, or that 3 rival families had standing orders to kill him on sight if the opportunity ever presented itself. The next evening he came in, Yuna noticed something different. He wasn't reading reports. He was watching her openly the way a man watches something he's trying to solve. Is the soup good today? He asked, his voice low and even. It's always good, Yuna said, setting down his water. But today the ajumma added extra anchovy broth. Don't tell anyone I told you, but it's the secret ingredient. Something shifted in his expression, the faintest curve of his mouth, gone almost before it appeared. Then I'll have 2 bowls, he said. Yuna laughed before she could stop herself, a real laugh, and for a moment, Choi Tae-yoon looked like a man who had forgotten what that sounded like. A few days later, Yuna found out exactly who he was. A coworker showed her a news article on her phone, hands trembling with excitement and fear. Choi Tae-yoon, 34, heir to the Choi conglomerate, a corporation that, according to whispered rumors, was simply the legal face of something far darker. Yuna stared at the photo. Same sharp jaw, same composed eyes, same man who had complimented her soup 2 days ago. Her stomach dropped. He's been coming here for months, her coworker hissed. Do you know what that means? If anyone from a rival family finds out he eats here regularly, this place could become a target. Yuna swallowed hard. Suddenly, the quiet man in the corner booth felt a lot less harmless. That evening when Tae-yoon arrived, Yuna was colder, more careful, keeping her distance the way the article had warned her to. He noticed immediately. Did I do something? He asked when she set down his tea without her usual conversation. Yuna hesitated, then decided honesty was easier than pretending. I read about you, she said quietly. I know who you are now. Something flickered across his face, something that looked almost like disappointment. And nothing, Yuna said, surprising herself. You still tip well and you still like extra anchovy broth. I just figured you'd want to know that I know. Tae-yoon studied her for a long moment like he was recalculating something. Most people run, he said finally. I'm too tired to run, Yuna said. I have a double shift tomorrow. This time, his smile reached his eyes. The following week, a customer at the next table grew loud, drunk, and insistent, grabbing Yuna's wrist as she tried to clear his table, slurring compliments about her figure that made her skin crawl. Yuna pulled back sharply, but his grip tightened. Before she could react, a hand closed around the man's wrist, not violently, just firm, immovable like stone. "Let go of her," Ti-Yun said. His voice hadn't risen at all, but the temperature of the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The drunk man's face went pale the moment he saw who was holding him. He muttered an apology, threw money on the table, and left without finishing his meal. Yuna stood frozen, heart hammering, not from fear of the drunk man anymore, but from the way Ti-Yun was looking at her, like he wanted to do a great deal more than just send the man away. "You didn't have to do that," Yuna said later, voice unsteady as she wiped down his table. "I know," Ti-Yun said simply. He didn't elaborate, and somehow that was worse or better, Yuna couldn't decide which. From that night on, something between them shifted permanently. He started arriving earlier, staying later. He learned her schedule without asking, always appearing on the nights she worked the floor alone. He noticed when she was tired, when her shoes were falling apart, when she skipped lunch to save money for her brother's textbooks. A week later, a brand new pair of work shoes appeared at the restaurant's back entrance. No note, no name, exactly her size. Yuna knew exactly who had left them. She wore them anyway. What Yuna didn't know, what nobody at Hanok Sarang knew, was that Choi Ti-Yun was engaged. Not by choice, not by love, but by a contract signed 3 years earlier between his father and the head of the Park family, a rival organization that controlled the southern districts. The engagement to Park Soo-ah had been forged to end a territory war that had cost both families dozens of lives. It was peace, purchased with Ti-Yun's future. He had accepted it the way he accepted everything in his world, with cold, controlled resignation. Locking that part of his life into a separate room of his mind, a room he never opened. Until a quiet waitress with tired eyes and a soft laugh started living rent-free in his thoughts, and the walls between those rooms began, slowly, to crack. A few weeks later, Park Soo-ah announced she was pregnant. The news spread through both families like wildfire. A Choi Park heir would cement the alliance permanently, end any possibility of future war. Ti-Yun's father was thrilled. The wedding date was moved up. Ti-Yun received the news in his office. Staring at the contract, his father slid across the desk, feeling absolutely nothing except a distant, hollow dread. He hadn't touched Soo-ah in months. He hadn't wanted to ask the obvious question, not because he doubted the answer, but because some part of him already suspected what it would be, and he wasn't ready to start a war over it. Not yet. Not until he had no other choice. That evening, he went to Hanok Sarang earlier than usual, before his shift with his father's lawyers, before the wedding plans could fully sink their claws into him. Yuna noticed immediately that something was wrong. He sat at his usual booth, but he didn't open his laptop, didn't touch his phone. He just stared at the steam rising from his tea like it held an answer he desperately needed. "Rough day?" Yuna asked carefully, setting down a small plate of pickled radish she knew he liked. Ti-Yun looked up at her, and for the first time since she'd known him, he looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with business. "You have no idea," he said quietly. Yuna sat down across from him, something she'd never done before, something completely against restaurant policy, and simply waited. "Can I ask you something?" Ti-Yun said after a long silence. "If you found out your whole future had already been decided for you, years before you had any say in it, what would you do?" Yuna considered this seriously, the way she considered most things, slowly and honestly. "I'd probably be angry for a while," she said. "But then I think I'd start looking for the one thing in my life that nobody else got to decide, and I'd hold on to it as hard as I could." Ti-Yun looked at her for a long moment, something raw flickering behind his composed eyes. "And if that one thing," he said slowly, "was something you weren't allowed to have?" Yuna's breath caught. She didn't have an answer for that. Neither, apparently, did he. The wedding announcement was made public the following week, splashed across business pages as a historic union between two of Korea's most influential families. Yuna read about it on her phone during her break, sitting in the alley behind Hanok Sarang, and felt something in her chest she had absolutely no right to feel. Disappointment. Foolishness. The cold realization that whatever strange, careful thing had been growing between her and Ti-Yun had always existed inside a fantasy, one with an expiration date she simply hadn't known about. That evening when he came in, Yuna was professional, polite, distant. She poured his tea, took his order, and didn't sit down. Tae-yoon watched her retreat to the kitchen with an expression that, for the first time, looked almost like panic. "You're upset," he said when she finally returned with his food, his voice low enough that no one else could hear. "I'm not upset," Yuna said, setting down the bowl a little too firmly. "I just think it's probably best if you don't come here as often anymore. You're getting married, Mr. Choi. People will talk." The use of his surname landed between them like a slap of its own. Tae-yoon's jaw tightened. "It's an arrangement," he said quietly. "It's not," he stopped himself, glancing around at the other tables, then lowered his voice further. "It's not what you think." "It doesn't matter what I think," Yuna said, and walked away before he could see her eyes burn. He didn't come back for 9 days. Yuna told herself she was relieved. She told herself a lot of things during those 9 days, most of which she didn't believe. On the 10th day, while she was wiping down the front counter during the slow afternoon hours, the bell above the door chimed, and Yuna looked up expecting a regular customer. Instead, a woman walked in, tall, elegant, dressed in a cream coat that probably cost more than Yuna made in a year, one hand resting protectively on the slight curve of her stomach. She scanned the restaurant with sharp, assessing eyes until they landed on Yuna, and something cold and calculating settled across her face. "You're the waitress," the woman said. It wasn't a question. Yuna's stomach dropped. She didn't need an introduction to know exactly who this was. "I'm Park Soo-ah," the woman said, walking closer, heels clicking against the wooden floor with deliberate slowness. "Choi Tae-yoon's fiancé, soon to be his wife." She let her eyes travel over Yuna, from her plain uniform to her tired ponytail, with an expression of open contempt. "I have to admit, I expected someone more impressive. He's been so careful about hiding you, I assumed there'd be more to find." Yuna's hands went still on the counter. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, keeping her voice level despite the way her heart was slamming against her ribs. "I just work here." Soo-ah smiled, slow and humorless. "Of course you do," she said. "And he just eats here, twice a week, for months. How sweet." The few customers seated nearby had gone quiet, sensing the tension the way people in Seoul often learned to early and from a safe distance. Soo-ah stepped closer, lowering her voice to something venomous and intimate. "Let me explain something to you," she said. "I am carrying the future of 2 of the most powerful families in this country. In a few weeks, I will be Mrs. Choi, and the kind of woman that men like Tae-yoon marry does not get distracted by." Her gaze flicked over Yuna again, deliberately, cruelly, staff. "So whatever little fantasy you've built in that head of yours, end it now. Quietly. Or I will end it for you and you will not enjoy how I do it." Yuna's hands were trembling now, but not from fear. From something hotter, sharper, rising fast. "I haven't done anything," Yuna said quietly, "except serve him food." "You exist," Soo-ah snapped, the calm cracking for the first time. "That's the problem. You exist and he looks at you like." She stopped herself, visibly furious that she'd revealed that much, and her hand shot out, gripping Yuna's wrist hard enough to bruise, nails digging into skin. "Stay away from him," she hissed. "Or I swear I will make sure you disappear so completely your own family won't find a trace." That word, disappear, landed in Yuna's chest like ice water, and something inside her that had spent 2 years swallowing insults from drunk customers, swallowing exhaustion, swallowing grief over her father's illness, simply ran out of room to swallow anything else. Her hand moved before her mind caught up to it. The slap rang out across the restaurant, sharp and sudden, snapping Soo-ah's head sideways, the sound of it bouncing off the wooden walls and freezing every single person inside. Soo-ah's hand flew to her cheek, eyes wide with disbelief, and for 3 full seconds nobody breathed. And then the front door opened again, and Choi Tae-yoon walked in 2 steps behind his fiancé, having followed her here the moment his men reported where she'd gone, and stopped dead in the doorway, taking in the scene. Soo-ah, cheek reddening, turning toward him with furious, expectant eyes, certain he would destroy the waitress on the spot. And Yuna, chest heaving, staring at him with the kind of raw, terrified defiance of someone who has just done something they cannot undo. Tae-yoon said nothing. He didn't move toward Soo-ah. He didn't apologize, didn't reprimand, didn't even look at her for longer than a single cold second. His eyes went to Yuna and stayed there, and something passed across his face that Yuna had never seen before, not anger, not shock, but something that looked dangerously close to relief, like he'd been waiting his whole life for someone to do exactly what she'd just done. "Ti-yoon," Suah said, voice shaking with fury and disbelief. "Did you not see what she just say something?" The silence stretched. 1 second. 2. 5. And in that silence, every person in that restaurant, Suah included, understood something that Ti-yoon himself had only just allowed himself to fully feel. "Take her home," Ti-yoon finally said, voice flat, not even looking at Suah. 2 of his men who had been waiting outside stepped forward immediately. Suah's face went through several emotions in rapid succession: disbelief, humiliation, and finally, a fury so absolute that her whole body shook with it. "You're choosing her," she said, voice cracking, loud enough now that the entire restaurant heard it. "Over me, over our child, over everything our family's built." Ti-yoon's jaw tightened, but his eyes didn't leave Yuna's face. "Go home, Suah," he said quietly. "We'll talk later." Suah stared at him for one more devastating second, then turned and stormed out, his men following at a careful distance, leaving behind a restaurant full of people who had just witnessed something they would be talking about for years. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Ti-yoon crossed the restaurant in a few long strides and stopped in front of Yuna, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "Are you hurt?" he asked, voice low, urgent, his eyes dropping to the red marks on her wrist where Suah's nails had dug in. "I'm fine," Yuna whispered, though her hands were still shaking. "Ti-yoon, what did I just do? Do you understand what I just did?" "That woman she's going to. I know exactly who she is," Ti-yoon said quietly. "And I know exactly what just happened." He reached out, gently taking her wrist, examining the marks with a tenderness that contrasted sharply with the cold fury simmering just beneath his composure. "And I should have done that myself, months ago." "This isn't a joke," Yuna said, pulling her hand back, panic finally catching up to her. "Her family, your father, Ti-yoon, I just slapped the future Mrs. Choi in front of a dozen witnesses. Do you understand what kind of danger I'm in right now? What kind of danger this restaurant is in?" Ti-yoon's expression didn't change, but something settled behind his eyes, a decision, final and absolute. "Yuna," he said quietly, using her name for the first time without any honorific, the intimacy of it landing between them like a confession. "You didn't put yourself in danger. I did. Months ago, the first time I sat in that booth and couldn't stop looking at you. Everything that happens from this point forward, that's mine to fix, not yours to carry." Yuna stared at him, breath shallow, the weight of his words settling over her like a verdict she hadn't expected and wasn't ready for. That evening, the restaurant closed early, Ti-yoon insisted, paying the owner generously for the lost revenue and posting 2 of his men discreetly outside. He didn't leave. He sat with Yuna in the empty dining room long after the lights in the kitchen went dark, the 2 of them alone with cooling tea and the kind of silence that says more than words ever could. "Tell me about the contract," Yuna finally said. "The one with her family. How does something like that even happen?" Ti-yoon exhaled slowly, looking down at his hands. 3 years ago, my father and her father were at war," he said. "Real war, people died. The contract, the engagement, it was the only thing that stopped it. I agreed because I didn't see another way. I told myself it didn't matter, that I didn't need," he paused, glancing at her, "that part of life." "And the baby?" Yuna asked carefully, because someone had to. Ti-yoon's expression went carefully blank in a way that told Yuna more than any words could have. "I haven't touched Suah in 8 months," he said quietly. "Not since before the engagement was even publicly confirmed. I never asked her about the pregnancy directly because I think some part of me already knew the answer, and I wasn't ready for what that answer would mean." Yuna's stomach turned. "You think the baby isn't yours?" "I think," Ti-yoon said slowly, "that today, for the first time, I'm finally ready to find out." He looked up at her, and the rawness in his eyes made Yuna's chest ache. "Because today, for the first time, I have something worth fighting for the truth over." By the end of the week, the story had spread through every level of Seoul's underworld. The Choi heir's mysterious waitress, the slap that humiliated the Park family's daughter in public, the silence that followed it. Ti-yoon's father summoned him to the family estate, furious, demanding answers, demanding Yuna be dealt with quietly before the Park family escalated. But Ti-yoon, for the first time in his life, walked into that meeting not as a son seeking approval, but as a man who had already made his choice, and was prepared to burn down everything his family had built to protect it. Meanwhile, Across the city, in a cold marble office overlooking the Han River, Park Soo-ah sat across from her father, tears of fury drying on her cheeks, and made a phone call that would change everything. "He humiliated me," Soo-ah said into the phone, voice trembling with rage. "In front of everyone over a waitress." On the other end, her father's voice was calm, dangerously calm. "Then we remind Choi Tae-yoon," he said slowly, "exactly what happens to families who break promises." Soo-ah looked out the window at the city lights, her hand resting on her stomach, and for the first time, something other than anger crept into her expression, something colder, something that looked a great deal like a plan already forming. "There's something else you should know about this waitress," she said quietly. "Something Tae-yoon doesn't know yet, something that's going to make this so much easier than you think." Across the city, in the back room of Hanok Sarang, Yuna had no idea that the storm had only just begun. The next morning, Yuna woke to find a black car parked outside her apartment building, the same one she'd seen drop Tae-yoon off at the restaurant a dozen times. For a moment, panic seized her chest, until the driver stepped out and bowed politely, holding up a phone with a message already typed and ready to show her. "Mr. Choi requests your safety be ensured today. Please allow us to escort you. He is dealing with his family now." Yuna stared at the message for a long moment, then looked up at the apartment building where her younger brother was still asleep, completely unaware that his sister had become the center of a war between two crime families overnight. She got in the car. Across the city, inside the Choi family estate, Tae-yoon stood in his father's study, the older man packing behind a massive desk, fury radiating from every line of his body. "Do you understand what you've done?" his father snapped. "The Park family is already making calls, demanding compensation, demanding the girl be removed permanently if necessary, and you're sitting there like none of this concerns you." "It concerns me a great deal," Tae-yoon said evenly. "Which is why I'm telling you now, nothing happens to her. Not from the Parks, not from us, not from anyone." His father stopped packing, staring at his son with something between disbelief and dawning horror. "You're in love with her," he said slowly, like the words themselves were dangerous. Tae-yoon didn't deny it. "And the engagement," his father pressed. "The child, that," Tae-yoon said quietly, "is exactly what I intend to find out the truth about. Today." The DNA results came back 3 days later, delivered quietly through a private clinic Tae-yoon trusted. No names attached, no records that could be traced back to anyone. He read the report alone in his office, late at night, the city lights spread out below him like scattered stars. The child was not his. He sat with that information for a long time, feeling not relief exactly, but something close to it, the final lock turning on a door he'd never wanted opened in the first place. He thought about calling his father immediately. Instead, he called Yuna. "I need to see you," he said, voice rougher than he intended. "Tonight, there's something you should know about all of this, about everything." Yuna, sitting in her tiny apartment with her brother asleep in the next room, felt her heart pound. "Where?" she asked simply. He picked her up himself that night, no driver, no security visible, just the two of them in his car winding through the quiet streets of Bukshan toward the river. He parked along the water, and for a while neither of them spoke, watching the lights of the city reflect off the dark surface of the Han River. "The baby isn't mine," Tae-yoon finally said. Yuna turned to look at him, searching his face. "How do you know?" "DNA test," he said simply. "I had it done quietly. Soo-ah doesn't know yet." He turned to face her fully, and in the dim light from the dashboard, Yuna could see something raw and exposed in his expression, something he'd clearly kept locked away for a very long time. "Yuna, I need you to understand something. Everything I'm about to do, ending the engagement, exposing the truth, whatever comes after, I'm not doing it because of some sense of justice. I'm doing it because of you." "Tae-yoon," Yuna said softly, his name feeling different in her mouth now, heavier. "If you end this engagement, you start a war. You said it yourself, that's what the contract prevented in the first place." "I know," he said, "and I've thought about it from every angle, every consequence, every casualty it might cost. And every single time I come back to the same conclusion." He reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "I would rather burn this entire empire to the ground than spend the rest of my life pretending I don't feel what I feel when I look at you." Yuna's breath caught, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain he could hear it. "That's insane," she whispered. "I know," he said again, and this time, when he leaned in, she didn't pull away. The kiss was slow, careful, like he was giving her every chance to stop him. And when she didn't, something in him seemed to finally, completely let go. His hand slid to the back of her neck, drawing her closer, and Yuna felt herself melt into him, into the warmth of him, into months of careful glances and unspoken longing finally given permission to exist out loud. When they finally pulled apart, both of them breathless, Yoon rested his forehead against hers, eyes closed. "I should have done that the first week," he murmured. "I would have run," Yuna admitted, laughing softly despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "Probably straight into traffic." Yoon smiled, a real smile, the kind Yuna had only seen flickers of before, and for a moment, sitting in a parked car by the river, the entire weight of the world outside seemed to disappear. It didn't stay gone for long. The next morning, Yoon called a private meeting with both families, his father, Suah, and her father, at the Choi estate. He laid the DNA results on the table without ceremony. The room went deathly silent. Suah's father's face went through fury, disbelief, and finally a kind of cornered desperation as he turned on his daughter, demanding answers she clearly didn't have. Suah, for her part, sat frozen, staring at the document like it might rearrange itself if she looked hard enough. "The engagement is over," Yoon said calmly, into the wreckage of the silence. "Effective immediately. I'll have my lawyers draft the necessary statements framed in a way that protects both families' reputations. But this contract ends today." Suah's father stood up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the marble floor. "You think this ends quietly?" he snarled. "You humiliate my daughter, expose her, and you think we simply walk away." "I think," Yoon said, voice still maddeningly calm, "that you have two choices. We end this contract with dignity, quietly, the way two reasonable families resolve a misunderstanding. Or," his eyes flicked briefly to Suah, who had gone very pale, "we end it loudly, with every detail made public, including whose child your daughter is actually carrying. I'll let you decide which version serves your family's interests better." The room fell silent again. Suah's father looked at his daughter, and whatever passed between them in that look told Yoon everything he needed to know. Suah's father hadn't known about the affair either, and now he did. "Quietly," the older man said finally, jaw tight, voice like gravel. "We'll do this quietly." He turned and walked out without another word, Suah hurrying after him, not once looking back at Yoon. Yoon's father remained in the room, staring at his son with an expression Yoon couldn't quite read. "You just ended a piece that took years to build," the older man said quietly, once the door had closed. "I ended a lie that should have ended years ago," Yoon corrected. "The piece doesn't have to end with it. I'll personally guarantee it through legitimate business agreements, shared territory arrangements, whatever it takes. I'm not interested in war, father. I'm interested in not living the rest of my life inside someone else's mistake." His father studied him for a long moment, then, surprisingly, let out a slow breath that was almost a laugh. "Your mother used to talk like that," he said quietly. "Before she met me, she had very strong opinions about arranged marriages." He paused, something softening in his face. "She would have liked this waitress of yours. Bring her to dinner. Properly this time." But peace, as it turned out, was not so easily guaranteed. 3 days later, while Yuna was closing up Hanok Sarang for the night, 2 men she didn't recognize entered through the back door, men who moved with the kind of practiced silence that told her immediately they weren't customers. Before she could scream, a hand clamped over her mouth, and the last thing she saw before a dark cloth covered her head was the kitchen's old radio, still quietly playing trot music into the empty room. When Yoon's security called him 20 minutes later, voice tight with controlled panic, reporting that Yuna hadn't checked in and the restaurant's back door had been forced open, something in Yoon went cold and absolutely, lethally still. He didn't shout. He didn't panic. He simply stood up from his desk, calling his head of security with a voice that made the man on the other end go silent with dread. "Find her," Yoon said. "I don't care what it costs. Find her tonight." The trail led, unsurprisingly, back to Suah's father. Though not Suah herself, Yoon's people confirmed quickly. The old man, humiliated and desperate to reclaim some leverage before the engagement's dissolution became official, had ordered Yuna taken to an abandoned warehouse near the docks, intending to use her as a bargaining chip, a way to force Yoon back into the original arrangement. What he hadn't accounted for was that Tae-yoon had spent his entire life building a network specifically designed to find people who didn't want to be found. And that for the first time in years, he was using all of it, every favor, every resource, every ounce of fear his name still carried, for one single purpose. By midnight, he had the warehouse's location. By 12:40, he was standing outside it, alone, having told his men to wait, because some things, he'd decided, he needed to do himself. Inside, Yuna sat in a cold concrete room, hands bound, the cloth removed from her head but her wrists aching from the rope. Two men stood guard near the door, occasionally glancing at their phones, clearly waiting for instructions that hadn't yet come. Yuna's mind raced, not with fear for herself exactly, but with a sick certainty that whatever happened next, Tae-yoon would come for her, and that whatever he did to get her back would cost him everything he'd just fought to build. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly to the nearest guard. "Whatever they're paying you, it's not worth what's about to happen to you if you don't let me go right now." The man laughed, low and unimpressed. Big talk for someone tied to a chair. From somewhere above them, faintly, came the sound of a door being opened, and then nothing. Silence. The kind of silence that made both guards go very still. The door to the room burst open seconds later, and before either guard could raise a weapon, Tae-yoon was simply there, moving with a speed and precision that belonged to a man who had spent years training for exactly this kind of night, even if he'd hoped he'd never need it. It was over in seconds. Yuna barely had time to process what was happening before Tae-yoon was crouched in front of her, cutting through the ropes binding her wrists with quick, careful movements, his hands shaking, the first time she'd ever seen him anything less than perfectly composed. "Are you hurt?" he asked, voice rough, eyes scanning her face, her arms, checking for any sign of injury with a desperation that made Yuna's chest ache. "I'm okay," she whispered. "Tae-yoon, I'm okay." He pulled her into his arms so suddenly, so completely, that Yuna felt the rapid hammering of his heart against her own, felt him exhale a long, shuddering breath into her hair. "I thought," he said, voice breaking slightly, "I thought I might be too late." "You weren't," Yuna said softly, her own hands finally coming up to hold on to him, fingers curling into the back of his jacket. "You're here, I'm okay." For a long moment, they simply held each other in that cold concrete room, the chaos of the situation fading into something quieter, something that felt, despite everything, like coming home. When Tae-yoon finally pulled back enough to look at her face, his expression had shifted into something Yuna hadn't seen before, not the careful composure, not even the raw vulnerability from the riverside. Something fiercer. Something that looked like a line had been crossed permanently and there was no going back from it. "I'm done being careful," he said quietly. "I'm done letting other people decide what happens to the people I love. Tonight, that ends, all of it." Yuna searched his eyes, understanding the weight of what he was saying. "What are you going to do?" What Tae-yoon did, over the following days, was methodical, thorough, and utterly without mercy, though not notably violent in the way the old families expected. He didn't retaliate with bloodshed. Instead, he made calls. Quiet ones to business partners, to government contacts cultivated over years of careful relationship building, to journalists who owed him favors they'd long stopped expecting to be called in. Within a week, evidence of Sua's father's involvement in the kidnapping, carefully documented, irrefutable, found its way to exactly the people who could destroy his remaining business interests without a single shot fired. The old man's empire, already weakened by the broken engagement, crumbled within days, his territories absorbed quietly by neighboring organizations eager for the opportunity. Sua herself, stripped of her family's protection and reputation, disappeared from Seoul's social circles entirely, last seen boarding a flight to somewhere no one bothered to track. A few weeks later, Yuna stood in the kitchen of Hanok Sarang, back at work because, as she'd told Tae-yoon firmly, she wasn't going to let anyone, not the Choi family, not the Parks, not anyone, take away the one thing that had always been hers. The restaurant's owner, having heard at least partial versions of recent events, had taken to treating Yuna with a kind of nervous reverence that she found more amusing than anything. Tae-yoon still came in, twice a week, same booth, same order, though now he stayed until closing and now everyone in the restaurant knew exactly why. "You know," he said one evening, watching her wipe down the counter with the same unwavering attention he always gave her. "My father wants to officially meet you. Properly. Dinner at the estate." Yuna paused, glancing up. "That sounds terrifying." "It absolutely is," Ti-Yoon agreed, completely unbothered. "He's already started planning the menu." The dinner, when it finally happened, went better than Yuna had dared hope. Ti-Yoon's father, gruff and intimidating on the surface, turned out to have an almost grandfatherly fondness for Yuna within the first 20 minutes, particularly once he discovered she'd grown up not far from where his late wife had been raised, and that she made a version of doenjang jjigae that, according to him, tasted almost exactly like his mother. "You see," the old man said to Ti-Yoon, gesturing at Yuna with his chopsticks. "This is what I meant. A woman who can cook properly and isn't afraid to slap someone when they deserve it. This is rare, son. Don't be an idiot about it." Ti-Yoon, for his part, simply smiled the same quiet, real smile Yuna had come to treasure, and reached under the table to take her hand, lacing his fingers through hers in a gesture that felt, for the first time, completely and effortlessly natural. By the end of the month, the business world had largely absorbed the news of the broken engagement, framed publicly as a mutual decision between families to pursue independent paths. Corporate language that satisfied everyone enough not to ask further questions. Privately, however, the story of the slap, the silence, and everything that followed had become something close to legend in certain circles, whispered about with equal parts awe and disbelief. The waitress who slapped a pregnant Mafia heiress and walked away not with punishment, but with the heart of one of Korea's most powerful and most untouchable men. Yuna, for her part, found the attention deeply uncomfortable, though Ti-Yoon seemed to find it endlessly amusing, occasionally calling her the most dangerous woman in Seoul, with a completely straight face just to watch her splutter in protest. 3 months after that night at the warehouse, Ti-Yoon showed up at Hanok Sarang on a Tuesday, not Thursday, breaking his own carefully established pattern for the first time in over a year, and waited until the restaurant had cleared out before approaching Yuna at the counter. "You're early," she said, smiling, until she noticed the small velvet box he was holding, half hidden in his jacket pocket, and the unusual nervousness in his expression, an emotion she'd genuinely never seen on him before. "Ti-Yoon, I've spent my entire life," he said quietly, "doing what was expected of me, following contracts I didn't choose, living a version of my life that other people had written for me." He stepped closer, taking her hands in his. "The first time I broke that pattern, it was because of you, and I've never been more certain of anything than I am of this." He opened the box, revealing a ring, simple, elegant, nothing like the ostentatious jewelry Yuna had glimpsed on Suwa months ago, but exactly perfectly her. "Marry me, Yuna. Not because of contracts, not because of families, not because anyone expects it. Just because I love you and I don't want to spend another day pretending otherwise." Yuna stared at the ring, then at him, tears already gathering in her eyes. "You're sure?" she whispered. "Ti-Yoon, your world, my world, they're so different. Are you sure this is what you want? Not what you think I deserve or what you feel like you owe me, but what you actually want." Ti-Yoon's expression softened completely, all the careful composure falling away until there was nothing left but raw honesty. "Yuna," he said gently, "the night you slapped Suwa, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, maybe ever. Not shock, not embarrassment, relief. Like someone had finally said out loud the thing I'd been too afraid to admit. I don't want a version of my life where that feeling doesn't exist. I want you, all of it. The restaurant, the late shifts, your brother's terrible jokes, all of it. That's what I want." Yuna laughed through her tears, nodding before she even fully found her voice. "Yes," she said. "Yes, obviously yes, you absolute disaster of a man." Ti-Yoon's laugh, real, unguarded, completely free, was the most beautiful sound Yuna had ever heard. The wedding took place 6 months later, at a small hanok in Bukshan. Not the grand estate venue Ti-Yoon's father had initially proposed, but the same quiet alley where Hanok Sarang sat, where it had all begun. Yuna wore a simple hanbok, her mother's, carefully altered, and Ti-Yoon wore black, sharp, and composed as ever except for his eyes, which never once left her face throughout the entire ceremony. The guest list was small and strange by anyone's standards. A handful of Ti-Yoon's most trusted men, standing alongside Yuna's co-workers from the restaurant, her brother beaming proudly in his university blazer, and Ti-Yoon's father, who cried more than anyone expected and loudly insisted it was just allergies for the rest of the evening. When the ceremony ended and Tae-yoon kissed his wife for the first time as such, the small crowd erupted into applause, and somewhere in the back, the restaurant's old radio, brought along specifically for the occasion, crackled quietly with trot music, just like always. A year later, on a quiet Sunday morning, Yoona sat in the small garden behind the home she and Tae-yoon now shared. Not the estate, which Tae-yoon's father had reluctantly accepted, but a modest house close enough to Hanok-sarang that Yoona could still visit whenever she liked, though she'd long since stopped working there, having instead taken over its management entirely, much to the elderly owner's relief. Tae-yoon found her there, sitting in the morning sun, one hand resting gently against the curve of her stomach, a curve that hadn't been there a few months ago. He sat down beside her without a word, covering her hand with his own, feeling the small, impossible flutter of movement beneath his palm for the first time. "Still think this is insane?" Yoona asked softly, watching the way his composed expression cracked completely, replaced by something so openly emotional it took her breath away. "Completely insane," Tae-yoon agreed, voice rough. "Best decision I ever made." He leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to her stomach, then to her lips, and for a long moment the two of them simply sat together in the quiet morning light, the most dangerous man in Seoul, and the waitress whose silence-breaking slap had changed everything. Finally, completely, exactly where they were always meant to be. If Yoona and Tae-yoon's story had your heart racing from that very first slap, hit that subscribe button right now, besties, because there's so much more Afro-Korean romance coming your way, dangerous men, fearless women, and love that refuses to follow anyone's rules but its own. Drop a comment and let me know, would you have slapped her too? Have you ever stood up to someone way more powerful than you, even when it terrified you? I want to hear it. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.